Liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, go from
Well, thank you, Andrew, and welcome to the June 19, 2019 edition of Space News. This is Angelo Di Grazia here from the Space Association of Australia, and tonight I will be solo in presenting this week's exciting episode of Space News. So let's get started. We'll cross straight over to the USA and US space policy. The House Armed Services Committee approved a proposal to create a Space Force. The committee recently voted in favour of an amendment to the National Defence Authorization Act that would create a US Space Corps within the Air Force led by a 4-star commandant. The Space Corps will have personnel and assets transferred by the Air Force. The Air Force would also be able to establish a separate, alternate acquisition system for defence space acquisitions. The language in the House bill will ultimately have to be reconciled with that in the Senate's version of the NDAA that creates a Space Force. The Senate's version of the NDAA also reforms Air Force management of space acquisitions. Those changes reflect the committee's concern about space procurements being managed in isolation and not coordinated across multiple agencies. Over to the International Space Station. NASA rolled out a multi-pronged strategy last Friday for increasing commercial use of the International Space Station. NASA will allow greater commercial use of the station, publishing a price list for station resources, and will also allow 2 private astronauts a year to visit the station on commercial crew vehicles for up to 30 days at a time. NASA will soon release a solicitation for use of a docking port on the station that could host commercial modules and will support separate studies of commercial free-flying stations. Other parts of the study will focus on stimulating commercial demand and better describing NASA's long-term demand for services in low Earth orbit. Greater commercialisation of the ISS, NASA argues, could help support development of commercial low Earth orbit facilities, allowing NASA to eventually transition away from the International Space Station. Meanwhile, companies are interested in the new opportunities to use the International Space Station offered by NASA but want more details about the plans. Bigelow Aerospace said last week that it had paid significant deposits to SpaceX for 4 dedicated Crew Dragon missions that could carry up to 4 people each to the station at a ticket price of $52 million per person. The company said it welcomed NASA's ISS commercialisation strategy, which would allow such flights to the station as well as make available a docking port on the station for commercial modules. Bigelow and others, though, said the devil is in the detail about how NASA will implement that strategy. Moving to the Moon. A NASA safety panel said that the agency should apply lessons learnt from the Commercial Crew Program for Artemis. The Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, meeting recently, said that the Commercial Crew Program provides valuable lessons such as how to work closely with industry and make use of alternative procurement mechanisms. NASA has indicated it plans to acquire lunar landers as a service, which could allow it to support multiple vehicles in development, an approach the panel also endorsed. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine called the Moon a waypoint for Mars. During a town hall meeting at the Glenn Research Centre recently, Bridenstine said that NASA was still committed to landing humans on the Moon by 2024 despite a recent tweet from President Trump that suggested the agency was focusing too much on the Moon. "The Moon is not the destination, the Moon is the waypoint," he said, for missions to Mars, which remains a long-term destination for NASA's human spaceflight program. Further, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine in a recent interview said last week that he estimates NASA will need an additional $20 to $30 billion to carry out the Artemis program. He gave that cost estimate over the 5 years he said it would take to return humans to the Moon. That's about $5.5 to $6.5 billion per year. Bridenstine and other NASA officials had previously declined to give estimates on the cost of Artemis. NASA sought only an additional $1.6 billion for Artemis in last month's budget amendment for 2020, meaning that costs will rise sharply in future years and prompting renewed concerns about how the program will be funded. Meanwhile, scientists and the chair of the House Science Committee shared concerns at a hearing last week that NASA's science programs could be cut to pay for the return to the moon. Republican Eddie Bernice Johnson, Democrats Texas, chair of the committee, said she was worried about a provision in NASA's budget amendment submitted a month ago seeking authority to transfer funds from other agency accounts to pay for the Artemis program. Starving science to fund human exploration is not the answer, she said. Scientists testifying at the hearing were also worried science could be cut to pay for the program. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine has said a number of times that NASA would not cannibalise science to pay for the moon program. Over to NASA Planetary. Scientists have found evidence of table salt on Jupiter's moon Europa. Spectroscopic observations of Europa by the Hubble Space Telescope detected the spectral signature of sodium chloride on the surface of the icy moon. The salt is not evenly spread over the surface, but instead found on the hemisphere facing Jupiter and concentrated in chaos regions that are evidence of recent geological activity. Scientists believe that the salt is coming from the moon's subsurface ocean of liquid water. Astronomers are set to begin work on the next astrophysics decadal survey. The 20-member steering committee for the Astro 2020 study will meet for the first time next month as they begin work to identify scientific priorities for the field in the next decade and the observatories and spacecraft missions best suited for them. The Astro 2020 final report is now scheduled for release in early 2021, a slip from the northern fall of 2020 because of ripple effects of the partial government shutdown earlier this year. At a House hearing last week, both members and scientists endorsed the overall decadal survey process, although some called for tweaks to the process. Over to the United Kingdom. A consortium announced plans last week for another launch site in Great Britain. The proposed Spaceport 1 is a vertical launch site that will be built on the Scottish island of North Uist. A local government council has agreed to spend £1 million to purchase the land for Spaceport, which would be used by small launch vehicles. The project is separate from a similar site planned for the northern coast of Scotland and comes a week after the British government said it would support development of spaceport facilities at an airport in Cornwall that would host Virgin Orbit missions. Over to Russia. Russia is planning a new satellite constellation for Internet of Things services. Roscosmos head Dmitry Rogozin said a new group of GONETS 2 satellites will be used for communicating with Internet of Things devices, particularly those related with infrastructure like bridges and railroads, similar to systems being developed by a number of companies. Rogozin didn't say when the new constellation would be deployed. Even robots need to slim down to be able to go to space. Roscosmos will launch a humanoid robot called Fedor on an uncrewed Soyuz launch in August, intended to test the use of the Soyuz 2 rocket for launching that spacecraft. Engineers, though, found that Fedor's shoulders are too broad to fit through the Soyuz hatch, requiring modifications to the robot. The Soyuz will dock with the ISS and cosmonauts will bring Fedor into the station for testing. To China. The Chinese government has issued new regulations for commercial launch companies in that country. The rules require companies to obtain government approvals before starting research, development and production of launch vehicles. The regulations include a confidentiality system for companies which must also follow export control regulations if considering operating outside of the country. China announced last week that it will fly 9 international experiments on its upcoming space station. Chinese officials said the experiments involving 17 nations will be flown on the station once completed in 2022. Those experiments range from microgravity research to space technology demonstrations. The experiments were selected as part of a competition run by the Chinese Manned Space Agency and the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. Meanwhile, China's decision to fly other countries' experiments on its space station has geopolitical implications. Outside experts say last week's announcement is part of a charm offensive and wider efforts by China to demonstrate that there are routes for other countries on Earth to stimulate their space technology and science sectors without the Americans. That station is scheduled to be completed in 2022, Chinese officials state, but that may require condensing previously announced schedules for launching its major elements. That schedule also depends on the status of the Long March 5 rocket, which has yet returned to flight after a launch failure nearly 2 years ago. To India. India has set a July 15 launch date for its next lunar mission. The launch of the Chandrayaan-2 mission is scheduled for the early morning hours of July 15 on a GSLV Mark III rocket. The spacecraft will take several weeks to reach the moon and entering orbit. A lander will separate from the orbiter and attempt a landing in the southern polar regions of the moon. India is considering developing its own space station. The head of the Indian Space Agency, ISRO, K. Sivan, said last week that the agency is contemplating at least a small space station where crews could do microgravity research. A formal plan on developing the station will wait until after India performs its first human space flight mission under the Gaganyaan program scheduled for launch by 2022. To commercial space. Space startups that once clamoured for attention are increasingly flying under the radar. There's a growing number of space companies that are operating in stealth mode, offering little public information about their plans even as they seek to raise money and hire employees. One reason companies are laying low is to avoid revealing too many details about their business plans that could inspire copycats. Eventually, though, even stealth mode companies must open up in order to win customers. Small launch vehicle developer Relativity announced last week that it will establish a rocket factory at NASA's Stennis Space Center in Mississippi. The company will lease a 220,000 square foot building at the centre and convert it into a factory that will ultimately produce 12 to 24 of its Terran 1 rockets a year. The company is receiving support from the Mississippi Development Authority, an economic development agency, and plans to invest $59 million in the factory. Relativity chose the site in part because it already does engine testing at Stennis. The company says it remains on schedule for a first launch of its rocket in late 2020. To SpaceX. After years of launch delays, 4 NASA technology payloads will finally get to fly this month. Those payloads are part of the Space Test Program mission launching on a Falcon Heavy no earlier than June 24, having slipped a few days recently from June 22nd. The Air Force said the work needed to finish integrating the various satellite payloads for the mission and complete launch operation preparations prompted the delay. The mission was originally scheduled for launch in 2015 when the Air Force awarded the contract in 2012, but was delayed by development issues with Falcon Heavy. The STP-2 mission will carry 24 satellites that will be placed in 3 different orbits using 4 burns of the rocket's upper stage. The NASA payloads include an atomic clock for deep space missions, a test of non-toxic green propellant, experiments to study the effects of space radiation on electronics, and 2 CubeSats for studying the ionosphere. NASA said last week that the agency contemplated alternative rides for some of those payloads because of those delays, but elected to keep them on this mission. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, says data from a constellation of satellites to be launched this month will be valuable in improving forecast. The 6-satellite constellation observing system for meteorology, ionosphere and climate 2, Cosmic 2, a joint US-Taiwan program, will be part of the launch payload of the Falcon Heavy STP-2 mission. The radio occultation data the satellites collect will help reduce forecasting errors, scientists said at a recent briefing. Cosmic 2 was to include a second set of 6 satellites, but those were cancelled in 2017. NOAA says it will make up for those satellites with data from other missions as well as from commercial providers. SpaceX has again pushed back testing of its Starship prototype in Texas. County officials said the road leading to the company's Boca Chica test site was closing starting June the 17th rather than earlier as previously planned. Those tests will involve static fire and tethered flights of a Starship prototype, the Starship Hopper, powered by a Raptor engine, and could include the vehicle's first free flight. SpaceX launches 3 Canadian radar imaging satellites recently. The Falcon 9 lifted off on schedule on the start of a 13-minute window from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California mid-morning and deployed the 3 RadarSat Constellation Mission (RCM) satellites into sun-synchronous orbits an hour later. The rocket's first stage, which previously launched the company's Crew Dragon spacecraft on a test flight in March, landed back at the launch site. RCM is designed to provide improved synthetic aperture radar imagery over the existing RadarSat-2, including faster revisits. Unlike RadarSat-2, which is operated by Maxar, the Canadian government owns the full imaging capacity of the RCM constellation. Over to United Launch Alliance. The last single-stick Delta IV rocket recently arrived at the launch pad for a July launch. The Delta IV Medium Plus 4-2 rocket is being built up at the launch pad at Cape Canaveral to launch the second GPS-3 satellite scheduled for July 25. United Launch Alliance is retiring the medium or single-stick version of the Delta IV because of its cost, but will continue flying the triple-core Delta IV Heavy well into the 2020s. Strata launch. The world's largest aircraft is up for sale. As we recently predicted on Space News, the world's largest aircraft is up for sale for $400 million. With the death last year of the founder of Strata Launch, Paul Allen, the company has slowly wound down its operations. Really sad to see that his once great vision is now slowly fading out. Okay, and finally, other news. The street outside NASA's headquarters in Washington has been given a new name. A stretch of E Street Southwest was recently named Hidden Figures Way after the book and movie Hidden Figures about the African American women who supported the early space program. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine and Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz were among those at the event. And finally, Starfleet may already be on Mars. NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter recently photographed a feature on the planet's surface that is similar to the chevron-shaped logo from Star Trek. The feature is called a dune cast by geologists, formed when lava flowed around the sand dunes, leaving traces of the dunes as footprints in the lava flows long after the dunes blew away. Well, that's all we have for tonight, and it's back to you, Andrew.